I'm David Altmejd. This is my show, The Serpent, at White Cube, New York. The first pieces that I made for this show are the two sculptures of musicians dressed in white with a special headgear, playing instruments that are in the shape of swans, or maybe they're swans in the shape of instruments. But I had been working for a while around the idea of music as being something that could be maybe symbolic of a more spiritual aspect. So I worked for a while on those sculptures of musicians, those sculptures of swan musicians. And parallel to that, I worked on a group of sculptures that are like the embodiment of raw, kind of like material, physical, feminine characters that happen to be dancers. And these are three sculptures that are sort of like, make me think of nymphs, three nymphs or three graces maybe, and that are dancing. Once I made these two types of pieces together, I became aware of the dialogue that they had. One representing a more sort of orderly, structured, spiritual aspect, and the dancers representing more like a vital energy, chaotic, material, feminine aspect. I have noticed the sort of emergence of the snake inside my work. It's not something that was intentional, but I just saw, like, from time to time, the snake would sort of peek its head out of a hole and go hide into a different hole. For this show, I just decided that I was going to tackle it head on, because I knew that it was potentially an extremely chaotic sculpture that would manifest. So I just made another sculpture to go alongside it that would sort of like maybe represent a more orderly type of energy, a musician, a sculpture that would sort of like be defined by a kind of like gridded order and a perfection in a certain way that would counterbalance the potentially like ultra chaotic aspect of the serpent. So that's what I did. I decided to make the sculpture of a snake charmer that was going to collaborate with the snake itself. That was a way of just making sure that the snake would not kind of like just explode in this monstrous kind of way, but would sort of like be seduced by that kind of spiritual, orderly music coming from the snake charmer. The way that I decided to approach and to build the serpent was to build it as a row of heads. They're sort of merging into one another. And they're sort of like all going in the same direction. So you can imagine kind of narrative with a beginning and an end. There's a transformation aspect. So they're sort of like transforming a little bit by a little bit like in an animation, Once the piece was finished, I could quite easily see each head as being like symbolizing a moment in a life. So I thought of the serpent as kind of like being the symbol of a life. I have these basic materials that I use as the sort of like the heart of the sculpture. But then on top of that, I add different types of materials that create a contrast. So for example, I use very synthetic materials, like plastic based, but I like to add more organic materials, like for example, hair or quartz crystals. I feel like a contrast there's always a tension that's connected to it, and I feel like that tension is sort of like creating a kind of energy, almost like electricity. And my goal ultimately is to make an object that just feels like it's alive. Like as an artist, I think that my role is not necessarily to invent something out of nowhere, but rather I really believe that I'm letting the unconscious manifest through me. I'm giving the unconscious a chance to be embodied. I'm giving it a shape. I'm letting it exist. But it's the unconscious itself that is deciding the shape that it's going to have and giving it a materiality and a physical reality where it didn't before.